I'm Professor Steve Rowe. I'm a real paleontologist, and you're watching Real Paleontology. And today we're talking monsters. Monsters so dreadful, so hideous, that simply to look at them could turn a man to stone. Yes, we're talking gorgonopsians, named after the three dread monsters of Greek mythology, among whom Medusa is the best known. Medusa was slain by Perseus, who cunningly snuck up on her and lopped off her head, looking only at her reflection in his shield. So maybe just watch the rest of this episode through the reflection in a handheld mirror, because you're going to be exposed to a bunch of hideous gorgonopsian images, in particular the biggest and ugliest of all, Inostranscevia. And here it is, undeniably strange, hideous, and terrifying to behold. But was it a true super predator? Here, I'm going to give you my call on this question based on the latest research and also highlight what I think is a significant and hereto unreported error in the scientific literature that significantly influences my interpretation. First, a quick summary of who Inostranscevia was and when and where it sits in the family tree of life. Well, like I said, Inostranscevia was a gorgonopsian. These beastly critters were the world's first iteration of the saber-toothed design. There have been many attempts at this since. I've covered a few in this series. Saber-toothed cats and marsupials are the best known. But gorgonopsians got there first, and they got there first by a long shot. Inostranscevia lived in the unimaginably deep past, around 260 to 250 million years ago. It bit the dust, so to speak, with the Great Dying, the Permian mass extinction event that took out as much as 90% of all living species, tens of millions of years before the appearance of the first dinosaurs. But when it was alive, it was the biggest bad guy around, reaching around 3 meters in length and 300 kilo in weight, right up there with the biggest of Siberian tigers today. What's its family history? Where does it hang out in the great tree of life? Well, although it looks strangely reptilian, it's a synapsid, which means it's more closely related to we mammals than any reptile, bird, or non-avian dinosaur. These all fall into the diapsid clade here on the left. Gorgonopsians sit here, in the middle of the synapsid branch. We mammals form these little twigs at the end. It's thought that they had a more active metabolism than reptiles, although they weren't truly warm-blooded in the sense that we mammals are. They may or may not have had hair, but they definitely had a more upright posture, distinct from the classic sprawling gait of reptiles. This means that they could move more efficiently, although it's most unlikely that they were endurance runners, at least by today's standards, and most researchers characterize them as ambush predators. I'm not so sure of this. Inostranscevia certainly wasn't a pursuit predator by today's standards. But then its prey weren't great endurance runners either. There simply were no long-distance endurance runners back there in the Permian. There was nothing like an antelope or wildebeest. It's all relative, and I think it may have been able to run down its prey in what would be a kind of slow-motion analogue of a modern-day pursuit by something like a wolf or hyena. We're also not sure whether or not their 5-inch long canine teeth were concealed when their mouths were closed. So there's a kind of established background. But what is the most recent scientific literature telling us? Well, for starters, we now know that Inostranscevia was a true intercontinental globe-trotting apex predator, probably the world's first. It was first described for material found in Russian Siberia back in 1922, but Camera and friends here in 2023 describe a new species from Africa, more than 11,000 kilometers away. Evidently, this giant Russian interloper knocked local African gorgonopsids off the apex predator roost toward the very end of the Permian. This was no mean feat because to get to Africa from Siberia, Inostranscevia had to negotiate huge expanses of hot, dry, hostile terrain. Bear in mind, the world was just comprised of the one supercontinent, Pangaea, at the time. Camera and Co. show that ecosystems were going absolutely nuts in this lead up to the big Permian endgame. Not long after their African debut, these African Inostranscevia were themselves kicked out within 2 million years by a new apex predator group, the therocephalians, such as Moscherinus here. These were also synapsids. At any rate, it was a heck of a long way to travel for such a short stay by the Russians. And then these new upstart therocephalians themselves took a bullet, extinguished in short order and replaced by yet another group of apex predators, the proterosuchids, superficially crocodile-like diapsid archosaurs. These were part of the reptile radiation. In some other parts of the world, synapsids hung on briefly to big predator roles for a bit, surviving the big dying. But basically, it would be a couple of 100 million years before any synapsid rose again to the top of the food chain. Such a rapid turnover of major apex predator groups has never been seen before or since. It sure was a wild time. Back to Inostranscevia. What more does the latest science tell us? Well, just this year, Suresh Singh and friends published this paper based on detailed analysis of synapsid jaw anatomy. It included Inostranscevia. They identified three basic groups: raptorial specialists, speed specialists, and power shearers. Raptorial specialists, such as Mesensaurus and Pteranodon here, have relatively lightweight skulls, superficially similar to those of monitor lizards. They were built to grip relatively small prey. The second group, speed specialists like Anatherapsids here, had a jaw anatomy that enabled fast, repeated strikes at slightly larger prey. But it's this third group, the power shearers, that includes Inostranscevia. Among these power shearers, Inostranscevia is part of a further subgroup, the deep shearing specialists. These are predators adapted to inflict particularly deep and damaging wounds on their prey. The appearance of huge power-sharing carnivores like Inostranscevia in the fossil record broadly corresponds with the appearance of increasingly large and potentially dangerous prey. Beasts like this rather formidable-looking giant herbivore, Scutosaurus, which could weigh up to a metric ton. It didn't just look formidable, it was protected by a layer of ossified scutes that would have been very hard to get through. And this brings me to what I think is an important revelation, a glitch in the scientific literature which needs to be corrected. As I've mentioned before in this previous episode, Bite Club, bite force relative to body size tends to correlate with prey size among carnivores. Now, to the best of my knowledge, no one has published a predicted bite force for Inostranscevia, but bite forces have been published for a number of other gorgonopsians, including other big deep shearing specialists like Rubigia here. Its skull was very similar in size and shape to that of Inostranscevia. Now, in 2021, Julien Benoit and colleagues published this very interesting paper. They presented detailed evidence of gorgonopsian on gorgonopsian violence in the form of bite marks in the skull of one inflicted by another. This is really cool. We know it was another gorgonopsian that done the crime because the accused left a tooth embedded in the victim's face, and you don't get much more incriminating evidence than that. Case closed. But I think there's a problem here. The authors go on to cite a bite force of 715 newtons for Rubigia, and then make inferences regarding gorgonopsian paleobiology based on this figure. Now, as I said, Rubigia was big, over 3 meters in length, with a skull up to 40 centimeters long, nearly as big as that of a big Inostranscevia. This didn't make sense to me. A hard-biting human could generate 715 newtons of bite force. Let me explain. Here is the skull of a very big Inostranscevia, next to that of a big African lion. In 2008, I published this paper comparing the skull of this African lion with that of Australia's own marsupial lion. Now, the African lion here is obviously dwarfed by the big gorgonopsian. I calculated a figure of around 17,500 newtons of muscle force and 2,900 newtons of bite force at the canine teeth for this big cat. This is more than 4 times greater than the bite force cited by Benoit et al. For a big power-shearing gorgonopsian. And this surprisingly low bite force led the authors to argue that big gorgonopsians, like Rubigia and Inostranscevia, lacked the bite force necessary to crack through bones. Bottom line is, I think Benoit et al. Have made a mistake, albeit an understandable one. They took bite force numbers for Rubigia from supplementary data provided by Lautenschlager and Co. in this 2020 paper. Benoit and colleagues drew the figure of 715 newtons from this spreadsheet. What I reckon they missed was this little asterisk at the top of the column. And I've got to say, so did I initially. But when you go to the bottom of the spreadsheet to see what this asterisk signifies, it says that the muscle and bite forces are scaled to model size. In short, these are not actual predicted bite forces for this animal. They could be much higher or lower. And in this case, I'm pretty certain that they are lower than the actual bite forces. I had to chase this up further. And in my wanderings through the interweb, I came upon this conference poster presented last year by PhD candidate Amanda Pennings. She's meticulously reconstructed the jaw musculature of Inostranscevia in 3D as part of a PhD. Amanda hasn't published an actual bite force for this specimen yet, but she has calculated the forces generated by the jaw closing muscles. And these are a whopping 42,000 newtons. These are more than twice those of my big African lion. And this was not a particularly big Inostranscevia. Now, the architecture of jaw closing muscles differs greatly between these two species, but as someone who studied and predicted bite forces in big carnivores for a couple of decades, I'm pretty darn sure that this Inostranscevia could have bitten harder than this lion, which generated nearly 3,000 newtons or 3 tons of bite force at its canines. Anyway, I won't speculate further on what Inostranscevia's actual bite forces might have been, and I'll wait with bated breath for Amanda to publish her numbers. But my considered professorial prediction is that this particular dread monster had a freaking huge bite, and this clearly has implications with respect to its predatory behaviour. Now, Singh and Friends 2020 suggests that deep shearing specialists, like Inostranscevia, likely used a few or perhaps one deep, slashing, debilitating bite aimed at fleshier areas of the body. This could have maximised damage to critical anatomy and efficiently incapacitated their prey. But they also note that gorgonopsians tended to have less extreme gapes and different, possibly less efficient jaw muscle architecture than saber-toothed mammals like Smilodon. They further suggest that they may have concentrated on relatively small prey. I certainly agree that they could have inflicted deep and debilitating bites on their prey. But I strongly suspect that the jaw-closing muscles of Inostranscevia and other power-shearing gorgonopsids were relatively bigger than those of any saber cat, more than compensating for any difference in efficiency. Their canines were also way more rounded and shorter than the flattened canines of Smilodon. This suggests to me that their bites could have been both relatively and absolutely way harder, and that their canine teeth were far less fragile. And remember, these can be replaced if broken. Bottom line is, I wouldn't be at all surprised if one day someone found the tooth of an Inostranscevia embedded in the skull of a 1-ton Scutosaurus. So, in conclusion, I'm at least tentatively putting this particular giant dread monster in the card-carrying super predator category. I reckon it was a big hyper-carnivore at the top of its food chain, with no natural predators and a penchant for big prey, approaching or exceeding its own body weight. And I'll wind it up here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments section. I'll be back next week with another super predator analysis.